Hey guys, Naz here. Today I'm going to be taking you through how I make custom joints, rotating joints for plush. And it's pretty simple to do once you have all the materials that you need. So here are some of the hard materials that you're going to need to get from a hardware store. My partner works at a hardware store, so I just asked him to pick these up for me. You're going to need a small bolt. You only really need something that's maybe an inch long or smaller if you only have a small space available where you want your joint, but I'm going to be using this example by making a rotating neck. So I have quite a bit of height that at the end of the bolt can go into. The next thing you're going to need is a nut that is appropriately sized for that bolt. You can buy them in kits that come together, or just make sure that they, when you go to the hardware store, that they fit together. You can either use a standard nut or you can use a lock nut. The lock nuts will not come unscrewed once you have screwed them onto the bolt, but to be able to screw on a lock nut you need to have access to both the end of the bolt and where the nut is going to sit. And it takes a lot of effort. You have to sort of have the end of the bolt braced with your screwdriver and then use some sort of wrench or needle nose pliers to forcibly lock that lock nut in place. So personally I prefer to just use a standard nut and then glue it once it's in place using Loctite, which is a glue used to make sure that nut's not going to come unscrewed. You're also going to need a pair of washers just to allow the rotation to go a lot more smoothly. So it is easier to buy them all sort of in a kit, but I've just gone ahead and I've bought, because I know exactly which nut, bolt and washer I want, I've just gone and bought a packet of each. Here in Australia it probably cost me $5 per pack, but I can get multiple joints out of the amount of nuts, bolts and washers that I have here. So you can see here, these are sort of the washers, the large, in quotation marks, washers that come with your standard kit. And here is the custom made washer that we're going to make for our rotating neck joint. The joints there are made for teddy bear sizes, for small arms and things like that, but you really want something that is going to be the width of the joint that you're going to be rotating. And obviously my pony necks are a lot wider than those tiny little joints there. So we're going to be making our custom joints, our custom washers, if you would want to call them that, out of Warbler. And I've been playing with Warbler for this purpose, and I found that it's fantastic because you can heat and cut the Warbler in absolutely any shape or size that you would like. So I'll just show you here quickly roughly how the joint is going to go together. Obviously our pony fabric for the neck and the lower head is going to be sandwiched between the silver washers and the Warbler, but this is roughly what it's going to look like inside our pony neck. So the other things that you're going to need if you're working with Warbler are going to be a heat gun. You can get these for relatively cheap. You'll also need a sheet of Warbler. You don't need a whole lot, I just buy it in large pieces so that I have as much as I need on hand. And you'll also need a screwdriver and some needle nose pliers. Now if you want to make a very long joint, you can also use this stuff called a threaded rod, and you can just cut it to size, either using a Dremel or a small saw, but I have had to use that on certain joints that are required to be very long, especially with characters that have very skinny necks and long necks. You might need a longer joint to keep that balanced. So now we want to work out the size of the joint that we're going to make. So I've worked out previously, because I've made a couple of rotating pony heads, I've worked out roughly what diameter the circle needs to be that is going to sit between my neck and the bottom of my pony head. So I've printed that out here and I'm just tracing that twice on my Warbler. Warbler sticks to itself when it's heated up and then pressed together, so I would recommend making it at least 2 layers thick. You can make it a couple more. I would probably suggest 3 or 4 if you were doing a very large plush, but I'm just going to use 2 here because the ponies are a little bit smaller to medium sort of size. The Warbler is very sturdy and you really aren't going to break it once it's built in and sewn into the plush. So I'm just using the the heat gun to heat up my pieces. I'm going to sandwich them on top of each other, press them down, and while the warbler is still heated up, that means it's a lot softer than it usually is. When it cools down, it stiffens. So I'm just going to use some scissors just to cut out my circle here that I marked with my Sharpie marker, and then I'm going to press this onto the table just to flatten it out a little bit. You might need to heat it up again to sort of make it a bit more malleable. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to mark the center point of our joint, and we want to make 2 of these joints. So I'm just showing you guys how to make one, but you need one for the neck and one for the bottom of your head. Or if you're making this joint for an arm, for example, you would need one for your torso and one for your arm. So I'm just making a hole in the middle using the bolt that I'm going to be basing the joint off of. So you can use a pair of scissors, you can cut out a little circle in the middle, or you can just push that bolt through up and down repeatedly from both sides, just so you don't displace too much of that warbler. But you can see here that I'm sort of wiggling it around, making that hole big enough for that bolt to go through. You don't want to make the hole much larger than the bolt, because you sort of want it to snugly fit so that that bolt isn't going to wiggle around, but you do want to make sure that it can fit through, because that warbler gets quite solid and it's going to be really difficult to forcibly push it through later on. So you're going to let that dry and, well, not really dry, but cool down and harden up, and you're going to cut out 2 pieces of fabric that are going to cover these joints. So don't drop it like me, but I just use some of this spray adhesive that is used for quilts, and I'm just going to push these joints down onto the fabric, and then I'm going to spray the back, and I'm just going to tuck the minky around. So this is going to be the wrong side, the side that we're not going to see, that's going to be inside the plush. But by doing this, you sort of you make a nice neat cover for your joint, and then we're going to sew this onto our pony head and to our body. And you don't really have any problem using this basting spray. It is made for sewing and quilting, so your needle is going to slip through that fabric, no worries. And I'm just cutting a little hole in the middle so that our bolt can fit through. So now we're going to pin these bits to our neck and to, I guess it's the neck on both pieces, but to the lower part of the head and the upper part of the neck of the body. So I personally like to try and match the nap so it's flowing from front to back, but you don't have to do this. Here I'm just putting the bolt and one washer. I'm going from the wrong side, so the warbler visible side, pushing up. This piece is going to be the bit that sticks on the neck of the body. You can see that that can rotate around there. And we have to put this bolt and washer in now, because with my ponies anyway, with the necks, I don't have any sort of open seam to access them from underneath. So I'm going to be hand sewing this disc to the top of the neck and completely closing off that pony body. If you were working on something like a arm where you had a seam open, as opposed to the body, which is going to have a closed seam, you might not have to do this, but just have your bolt prepped from the underside as you're pinning it and enclosing that space there. So I'm just repeating the process for the head, and you can sort of maneuver the fabric a little bit to make sure that it fits on that circle perfectly. I know that my fabric is the correct sort of length to fit around the circumference of that circle, just because I've worked that out previously, but you sort of have a little bit of wriggle room. You can sort of stretch or very lightly bunch the minky to make it match the particular circle that you've made, but try and get it to match both the top and the bottom piece. So now I'm just going to go and I'm going to hand sew. I'm going to ladder stitch all the way around and just attach these discs to the head and to the body. What I like to do is I like to ladder stitch most of the way around and just leave a tiny little gap at the back, and I'm going to just use some pliers or tweezers, and I'm going to add more stuffing into the neck cavity, because there's usually sort of a bit of a pocket where there's not much stuffing after you add this disc. And when you're doing the rotating joints, especially with something as heavy as a head going onto a neck, you really want that to be nice and sturdy. You don't want to have a floppy neck when you're going to have a big heavy head resting on top. Otherwise it's sort of going to wobble around and it's not going to look very good, or hold that sort of rotation very nicely. So I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to finish ladder stitching and closing up that little hole. Not much different to if you were attaching a neck to a head in the first place, but I would recommend going around and doing more ladder stitching and at least going around this disc twice, if not probably 3 times. And you can see there I have sort of that nicely stuffed neck section, and here you can see the head's finished also. This is just a sort of an example of how they're going to fit together. Now when you're going to be doing a head like this that is going to be bolted down onto the neck, you want to open up a seam at the back of the head, because you have to be able to access the inner part of the head for you to sort of add the upper bolt and washer. So with my ponies I've added a seam at the back of the neck just for this purpose. It doesn't really need to be there for patterning reasons, it's just so that I can open up just a little section. I probably opened up too much here, but I just really wanted to be able to show you guys what it looks like with what I'm doing on the inside. But you can either leave this open when you are initially sewing the plush. You could also, for the head, you could machine sew the circle on the bottom and then slip the disc in afterwards. That's a little bit of a neater look, but you can do it this way as well. It just depends on if you want to add that into your machine sewing. So I'm just emptying out the bottom of the neck here of stuffing so that I can get in the back, but you can also leave this empty and do the joint and then stuff the entire head. It just depends on what you prefer. Personally, I like to stuff most of the head first, because I find it kind of fiddly to have to stuff from the back when it's already attached to the neck, but you might not find it as difficult. So here you can see I've just added a washer and a nut from the top, and I've sort of used my hand to push that down as much as possible. Make sure that you keep hold of the bolt so that it doesn't get pushed down into the neck and lost. So because I haven't used a lock nut, I'm going to use this product called Thread Locker, and it's just like a little glue that is going to stop that bolt from coming undone, or that nut from coming undone later. So I don't have 2 pairs of needle nose pliers, so I'm using just a pair of snips, essentially just to gently hold the bolt, and I'm using my pair of needle nose pliers to tighten up the nut. In this case, you can use a proper wrench if you have one, but I just had those snips and pliers on hand. So you want to sort of test how tightly that joint is held down. You want to make sure that it's not too loose, but it's not too tight that is going to stop you from being able to rotate the head altogether. If anything, I would recommend that you make it a little bit tighter rather than a little bit looser, just so that the head will hold its position and not sort of wobble around. You really want to make sure that those layers of fabric are sandwiched quite tight between those two, but just sort of give it a wiggle and see how it's moving and see what you'd like. So now I'm just going in, I'm putting the stuffing back where I took it out at the back of the neck, and you're really almost done. All you need to do is then use a ladder stitch to close up the hole you made in the back of the neck. I like to do it from this area here, especially on ponies, because your mane is 99% of the time going to be covering this section at the back of the neck. So I'm just taking a thread in a matching colour to what I'm doing, and I'm just using a ladder stitch to close up the seam at the back there. You can probably go over this section twice just to make sure that it is nice and sewn up and no seams are going to pop at the back of the neck. And that's pretty much it. Your rotating neck joint is done. You can use this for pretty much any rotating joint that is going to have sort of a section touching another section. You could use this for arms, you could use this for legs. All you would have to do is modify that warbler piece into a different size or shape. You can use things like ovals, but just keep in mind where that centre of rotation is going to be compared to the disc of warbler that you make. I probably should have made this joint a little bit tighter. You can see it's a little bit wobbly when I'm moving it around, but that I guess just shows you what can go wrong if you don't make it tight enough. You can see a little bit of ladder stitching showing around here. You could pick the seams a little bit more to make that look a bit more seamless, or you could sew, as I like to do, sew the disc, sew the circle of fabric on the bottom of the headpiece, and that just makes it a little bit neater. You won't have those ladder stitch marks there. But I hope you found this useful. You can sort of make these joints for almost any plush that you're going to make. I'm going to be using this technique on the life-size Twilight Sparkle I'm making soon, but she's going to have a much bigger neck, so I'll probably make a separate tutorial showing how I made the joint for her neck, because it's going to probably need to be made out of wood or something similar, because it's going to be holding up a lot more weight and is going to be much wider. But I'd say you could get a pretty wide joint using this method, using warbler. Just make sure that it's thick enough so that when you apply pressure to it, it's not going to snap, but it's very solid, as I mentioned earlier. Anyway, I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!